Hello, yes, it's on. Welcome back, you all. How was lunch? Good? Yeah, I really liked it as well. I'm a bit stuffed right now. But okay, our next speaker has visited the Keukenhof twice with her mother, and she had a somewhat traumatic experience in the Netherlands because she got locked up in a castle garden once. I'm so sorry about that. She really likes emojis and really likes GIFs. Give it up from, all the way from Phoenix, give it up for Maura Teal, everybody.
Hi. I've never had an owl introduce me. Thank you. All right, hi everyone. It looks like we've had another wonderful lunch. We've had a great couple days here in the Netherlands. I'm super excited to be sharing some information with you today about optimizing all the things. So, a little background about me. I am a software developer at a company called Pagely. We do managed WordPress hosting with a focus on a lot of enterprise-level clients. I'm also on a team working on our new managed hosting WordPress product called NorthStack. It's not just managed WordPress, though. We're also going to cover non-WordPress sites. We're going to focus on a serverless product. It should be pretty interesting, so find me after if you have any questions on that. And also my background is a little bit in some media. I worked for a subsidiary of Time Inc., working at scale on a WordPress site. So I've done a little bit of everything, and I really love site optimization. I also love memes, as was kind of mentioned before. So I couldn't quite do this talk without talking about optimizing all the things. But I want to kind of get into what we're optimizing for, or maybe who we're optimizing for. And mainly, most of you are here today because you want to optimize your website for your business. You want to reach customers. Maybe you want to increase revenue. So Google DoubleClick for Publishers actually mentioned in, I think, like 2016, that sites that loaded within 5 seconds made up to double the ad revenue of sites that loaded within 19 seconds. That's quite a huge gap, but it's also notable that there is a really clear division of revenue from things like ads. And that also goes on to other sorts of revenue, to e-commerce, where you're bringing in more revenue if your site is loading quickly and people feel like they can quickly achieve what they want. And we also potentially want to retain users. So on your site, especially if you're interested in content marketing and SEO, you want people to continue reading your content. You want people to continue browsing. The BBC found that they lost 10% of users for every extra second that the page took to load. And then from personal experience, you also want to stabilize your hosting costs. As sites grow, as we expand, as we scale up, we find that hosting can get quite exorbitant. And you end up using more resources, you need to expand to multiple server clusters, you need failovers. The costs can get pretty expensive. And if you are overusing resources on a site that's not optimized, you're paying even more. You might not be paying as much in developer costs, but that money's got to come from somewhere, and it's going to come every single month in the form of a bill. So we want to stabilize hosting costs as well. But this is the real thing. This is really what I want to focus on, is the humans. This is why we're optimizing our site. This is why we're at this conference. We want to have people visit our website and be able to browse it. We want them to be able to access the site. Now, talking about accessibility is a whole nother talk. It's a whole nother discussion. But in our use case, I'm really talking about accessing users and allowing users to visit our site that are maybe in a rural area, that maybe have very slow internet connections. They're only on 3G when you are testing your website on 4G, LTE, the fastest internet, gigabit. So you want those users to be able to visit your site and not feel like you don't care about them. There's also device limitations. So we've got lots of users perhaps that are maybe on old devices without much memory. And if you've got very heavy JavaScript, lots of assets loading, you're going to bog down their devices. And therefore, you're losing revenue. So you have people that can't make it to the page that they want. Say they only have a phone to access your website. And they won't be able to make a purchase or read that next article. So you're losing in ads, you're losing in user confidence, you're losing user trust. And finally, not global, search. So we've got search. That's why we're all here. So Google algorithms focus on crawling sites. That's something a lot of us know now. We know they focus on site speed. And we want to make our site faster. I couldn't tell you the exact algorithm that they're looking for, just like in Jono's talk last night, where he was saying, no one really knows what they're doing in their algorithms, but we always just want to try to be better. And by making our site faster, making it more accessible for the humans, for our business needs, we're also making it better for search. We're improving that performance. One other little thing I wanted to mention as well with that is, if your site's slow, indexing is going to be harder. So there will be fewer pages crawled in a short amount of time. Say, if your site's very slow, you might only get 10 pages crawled, where a fast site would have 100. And that does lead me to, where should we start? And there are a couple of interesting tools. A big one I really like is Google PageSpeed. It's free. And it's a site where you can go enter your website address, and you'll get an entire page of information suggesting what you can do to improve your website, suggesting what type of optimizations might improve your page ranking. Another option is GTmetrix, Web Page Test, and Pingdom. It should be noted that GTmetrix, Web Page Test, and Pingdom also provide a lot of information about optimizing your site, what could be done better, and how it's performing. But Google PageSpeed doesn't tell you the exact location it's testing from. And this is notable when you're living in Europe, living in perhaps a remote location. You don't always know where everyone's coming from, where your traffic's coming from to test these things. So the location of your test traffic, to me, is very important. It should also be noted that Pingdom is a paid-only tool, but they also provide a lot of other information about how to test, about uptime monitoring, things like that. So it's still worth exploring. And Google PageSpeed, to me, is very, very user-friendly. So there are pros and cons to each, but that's why you can utilize all of them, the first 3, for free. So it doesn't hurt to go ahead and check out each one. So I want to take a little pause here and show you an adorable puppy and talk to you about the difference between site speed and page speed. So there is a small difference in the words we're using there, where site speed is talking about the overarching average of the speed of every page. So we're looking at the load time of a page from first byte all the way down to completely rendered and painted on the page. And then the site speed is taking an average of multiple pages throughout the site. So they're slightly different, but honestly used interchangeably in a lot of places. I probably will too. So here is webpagetest.org. This is a little view of kind of what you see when you enter in your site. You pick a region, it's got the region where it's from. I picked Virginia because I think I have an East Coast server for this site. So I was kind of just curious what it would be like. And then I've got a first view run. You could run this multiple times as well and see if you get different results each time. That would be indicative of how you're caching the site, if it's working well. But you'll notice it's got some grade scores up there. And honestly, those can all be taken with a grain of salt. This is a very basic site, and it really should score well. But on a large enterprise site, on a large media site, it's much more challenging to get those results. And next, we've got what the PageSpeed Insight looks like. So on Google PageSpeed Insights, there is a plethora of information Honestly, perhaps a little too much for me to get started with. So I actually scrolled down on this page when I took the screen cap because there's a section called opportunities. And they're just that. They're opportunities to improve your website. Most of them are front-end related. So Google doesn't know what version of PHP you're running offhand. They don't know what type of server you're running on, what type of setup. But they can read your CSS, they can read your JavaScript, they know how many scripts are being loaded, and how long it took the server to respond. So they've got a list of suggestions there. That's a pretty safe place to start. So, where do we start? The first one, to me, is very important. And I'm a developer, so this might be something that's a little bit more challenging to work with if you are managing a site and not a developer yourself. But you should check what version of PHP you're running. And this is extremely important, not just for the sake of security. There could be a whole nother talk just about security and making sure your site is up to date. But it's helpful for performance. It should be noted that in 2015, 2016, when PHP 7 was coming out, and everyone for WordPress was kind of preparing for it, Aaron Jorbin was running speed tests. And he noted that WordPress ran about 50% faster when it was upgraded from PHP 5.6 to PHP 7. That's a huge jump in performance, and it's so worth it. And after PHP 7, 7.0 to 7.1 to 7.2, and now we're up to 7.3, there have continued to be minor performance enhancements to the PHP language. It's extremely important to also keep your WordPress up to date, your core and your plugins and your themes, because those theme and plugin developers also like to make adjustments, make enhancements, especially if you notice something and reach out to them and are willing to work with them. But check your PHP version, please. It's also been said, and this is a little bit more of an anecdote, that we could also save some of the Earth's resources by doing this. We save energy and power by running sites on PHP set versions of PHP 7 versus PHP 5.6. We're actually saving the planet by upgrading our PHP. I would also like to note that I have it in my notes here as a link. There is a plugin out there called Site Health Check, I believe, on WordPress.org. It's made by the WordPress.org community team. And that will show you your PHP version if you install it. It's not going to do anything else bad. It's just going to give you some initial information about what's happening on your server, what version of PHP you're running, and allow you to make a couple of decisions on how you want to handle it. So let's get on to some more nitty-gritty stuff. What next can we do? Well, we can use something called a content delivery network, a CDN. Many of you may have heard of this before. Essentially, you are moving your content from your site by utilizing this network onto the company's network of servers distributed globally. So your assets are closer to your end user. Say your site and your server is located here in the Netherlands, but I'm trying to visit your site from Phoenix, Arizona. That information has to travel all the way from the Netherlands to me over in Arizona. Say you have 100 images on a page that I'm trying to access. That's a lot of time just in making that connection across the ocean and then across most of the United States. If you're using a content delivery network, then you've got a server set up much closer to Phoenix, Arizona as part of that network. That is what my computer is going to connect to, and therefore get the information much, much, much faster. And there are some free options, there are some paid options. Namely, Cloudflare has a good free tier that I recommend to a lot of people if they're just trying to get their site off the ground and take a little bit of load off their servers, because the content delivery network can deliver your information, and therefore your server does not have to deliver it. Take some of the load off. Sucuri also provides this. A company called Fastly provides it. Many of the WordPress hosts in the space, Managed WordPress, provide it. Alternatively, there's also a couple of companies like Amazon's CloudFront, Akamai, Rackspace, and Google. All of them are perfectly good options depending on what you're trying to do and achieve and who you're working with. Second to that, while we're talking about CDNs, is full-page caching. So many of the CDNs provide this. It's something called full site acceleration, where the entire site, the entire page that gets loaded in HTML, gets cached on those same CDN servers and delivered much more quickly. So the user never even makes any sort of connection to the site. Previously, when I was talking about CDN, I was talking about just the individual assets being served. But let's take the entire page, the entire site, and put it on a server closer to the end user. That can give you some blazing speed enhancements. Many of the managed WordPress hosts leverage this. There are a few plugins that leverage this. They don't necessarily get the advantage of the CDN servers and network, but you can install something like W3 Total Cache, WP Rocket, WP Super Cache. If you search full page caching on WordPress.org, you'll find quite a bit. That can get a little bit advanced mode though, so I would caution you if you do decide to do that and are not a developer or advanced site manager. And I'd also like to note that this can be challenging with e-commerce. Not only can it be challenging with e-commerce, it can be challenging on sites that have a lot of load for their admin level users, for administrators, people going on the back end, people who shouldn't be seeing cached content. And if you're not familiar with the concept of caching, essentially you're making a copy of that information that gets served from the server, from the website, wherever, and saving it so that the server doesn't have to do any work to render it. So you're saving a copy for any given amount of time. Perhaps it's 5 minutes, perhaps it's 10, perhaps it's an hour, perhaps it's a year. You are marking that information as, yeah, that doesn't need refresh, that doesn't need updated, that doesn't need to retrieve more information from the server. So let's serve up a copy more quickly rather than trying to go through all the code and re-render it. So I would caution on that note. And next up, we've got some image optimization. And with image optimization, I generally like to recommend not only utilizing a CDN, some sort of service to perhaps distribute your images more quickly, but I also recommend optimizing your images on the server. When you upload to WordPress, there are a lot of plugins that do this as well as external services. Essentially, you want to compress the size of your images. When you save an image out of Photoshop or any other image service like that, straight from your cell phone perhaps, that has a lot of extra data attached to it that can be compressed, that can be trimmed out, so that you might have a 25 megabyte file that could be trimmed down by half. You also would want to downsize your file, obviously, but you don't want to sacrifice quality. So that's where some of these image optimization tools come in handy. There is a WordPress plugin called EWWW, I believe is what it's called. There's something called WP Smush It. There's something called Imsanity. There's something called Prestham, which is a proprietary Pagely product. Essentially does some of the similar things that you can achieve with the other ones. There's a service called Cloudinary, which is pretty unique because you would upload your image to WordPress, and then Cloudinary takes it over to their servers, does compression magic, and you can actually request any image size that you want on the fly. So you don't have to necessarily wait for the server to have a bunch of copies at different sizes for every thumbnail. Cloudinary will provide a service that gives you all of these updated image sizes on the fly. It's a lot of fun. That's a whole nother rabbit hole because there are so many things that you also might want to consider. If you're a photographer, image compression is a big challenge because you want to serve high quality content to your users, especially now we've got Retina displays to worry about. But then we go back to worrying about the humans that should be able to access our site. What if you're on a 3G connection trying to download a 6,000 pixel wide image? It's no fun. So something to keep that in mind is you always want to be running some sort of compression. And I should also note that just compressing on your computer before you upload to WordPress is usually not enough. Because you upload to WordPress, and then right on your server, WordPress does the work of making the different image crop sizes that you want available to you. We're all spoiled by that. We're all spoiled by the fact that we can upload a several thousand pixel by several thousand pixel wide image, and then we've got our 150 by 150 thumbnail, 400 by 300 little header image, Facebook crop. It's all ready to go. but it's not necessarily tuned for the best optimization to be the smallest possible file size while still retaining some quality. And talking about images, talking about assets, let's move on to some of the assets of a website. Let's move on to things like HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. What we want to do is we want to minify those files. We want to remove all of the unnecessary white space where possible. When we're serving up those assets, we want to make sure that they're concatenated where possible. Because you make these connection times, you make these changes, and every time you connect to the server to download something like an image asset, like a CSS file, like a JavaScript file, it takes time just to make that connection to the server, just to handshake, to confirm you're connected to the right server, and then download it. We want to make sure that we're minifying those, concatenating them, and also we want to limit frivolous scripts. And this is a big challenge if you're running a small site on a shoestring budget, and perhaps making use of a lot of different plugins. Many plugins want to upload and utilize their own scripts on your site. And they don't care what other scripts are getting loaded on your page. So many people say, oh, well, is there something wrong with having 40 plugins on my WordPress site? No, there's not. There's lots of big sites that have more than that. But the people managing those sites are very careful to look at what those plugins are doing on the front end of their sites where visitors are trying to access it. Is every one of those 40 plugins uploading its own JavaScript file that the front end is trying to load when someone hits the site? No. No. If they are, then the good plugin developers, then people who have put some thought into the optimization would provide some sort of hook. Actually, WordPress does this. WordPress provides a hook that you can unset the JavaScript file and load it in a separate way. As a developer, that's something that we do, is we will kind of concatenate and optimize those files. It can get rather complex and is much more technical than this talk is. But if you have any questions about that, I can chat about that later. But limiting frivolous scripts is a good rule of thumb. And that goes along with tracking scripts. We all have Google Analytics on our site, right? For the most part. I do. And we also perhaps want to do event tracking. We also perhaps want to try out a new service that provides other tracking analytics, perhaps provides A/B testing, gathers additional information about the hotspots on your site. All of those are adding in extra scripts, extra load time. Most of them are tuned for performance and try to stay out of the way. But it's certainly something that every time you add to your site, you have to think about, how much load time is this adding? How much is this weighing down the people trying to access my site? So let's talk a little bit about some more advanced tips. If we're reviewing a website, we want to open up something like Chrome Developer Tools. When you're in Chrome, it's Option-Command-I believe, is the keyboard shortcut. And it's got a couple of really interesting tabs. When you open up the Performance tab, you get this great view of all of the potential interactions that are available on your website that happen as the site loads. If you open the Network tab, you can see the waterfall. So from the first connection to the website, you can see which asset loads in which order and how long it took. It's something that is worth poking around with, because you can't hurt your site by opening up Chrome Developer Tools, as long as you don't enter in some JavaScript you have pasted to your clipboard, say. But you can't hurt your site by exploring some of this information. So I implore you to. And next, let's talk a little bit even more advanced, a little bit more of a deep dive into the back end of our site. Let's talk about databases. And this is a totally unrelated image. I just love it. But since we're talking about databases, let's talk about some of the optimizations that we can make. With WordPress sites, especially at scale, this is something that we want to watch table size, we want to watch indexing, and we want to manage everything on a case-by-case basis. There is no silver bullet. There is no way to just fix the database performance of a website. But there are a lot of small optimizations that we can make that make a huge impact. On sites with huge WP meta tables, Often we found at Pagely that adding an index to that table to make it more quickly scanned when you're searching for information makes a huge difference. Another thing I found is that when I have to write custom MySQL queries, changing the location of a join, some sort of select, adding a limit or changing the limit, you should never go without a limit on your MySQL queries that are custom, can all make quite a large impact. Perhaps you don't need to be querying for 10,000 results. Maybe you only need the first 100. You should change that limit so that the table gets scanned for a shorter period of time, and therefore your MySQL performance goes up. There are a ton of little micro fixes that make such a big impact. So notice that MySQL queries are not all created equal. I tend to use something called SQL Pro. Alternatively, I use a program called Table Plus. SQL Pro is free, though. And I will test out my MySQL queries on my local database. They'll run much more quickly than perhaps a production site, but it will tell me how long that query took to run on the first, on the second, on the third try, because perhaps something adjusts in the middle there. But I can test out the different queries that I want to make by entering the custom query in and watch the changes in live real time. Perhaps you could do that on the server too, but make sure you've got a development or staging environment. I still wouldn't run test MySQL queries on a production environment, even if you're just selecting things. You don't want to bog down a site. But there are so many interesting changes that can be made, especially at scale, that will improve a site. And additionally, we can talk about the server level. We can talk about different setups that are available. And this is getting kind of deep into the advanced mode. But it's something that if you're not an advanced person yourself, if you're as far as development is concerned, if you're not a developer, if you're not an engineer, you can talk to your hosting company if you notice your site is growing and your performance is suffering, and you've addressed some of the other elements of your code, like your PHP version and unnecessary PHP calls, perhaps, and your MySQL calls. You can address your setup. And that's something that most sites in WordPress run on some form of Linux with Apache and Nginx. Many of the sites on Pagely are Apache Nginx combination, but a lot of those we'd like to see shift to using full Nginx. There's also a new Nginx product called Nginx Unit that we're looking into using. And finally, I want to note this. I noted it in the CDN part of our discussion, but location. Location of your servers is so important. If you're using, and GDPR has changed this a bit, I think, but if you're using a server over in the United States and the bulk of your customers are in Europe, you should move your site to a server that's located in Europe. It's not something that comes to mind super quickly, at least to the people I talk to, and especially as a developer, I don't put a ton of thought into it, but I moved my personal site to the west coast of the United States because that's where I live. I live over there. I don't need it on the East Coast as much because I don't talk to people on the East Coast as much. I don't send them to my site to go visit and check it out. So I want it to live closest to my end users, closest to the people that I want reading my site. All of these little things can make such a huge impact on how your site runs, on how people perceive it. Many of us have gone to a website, perhaps on our phones, and just sat there and looked at an empty screen. Thought, what is going on? Why is this so slow? Maybe it's my internet connection. Well, I went to this other website, and it worked great. So, you fixed your code, you've set everything up well, perhaps added more caching. What else can you do? Well, you should monitor your performance. I mentioned GTmetrix earlier, I mentioned Pingdom earlier. Those both have services that you can sign up for. They both have fantastic options that will watch your site and keep an eye on the performance so you can go back and see historical data about how your site was running. Say you make a change, say you remove a plugin that was loading a very large script on the front end of your site that you didn't really need. You can watch that dip in the amount of time it took for your visitors to load a page. You can also cache more things. I think I said cache a bunch of times already on this talk, but you can always cache more. It tends to be a very advanced thing that I've already given talks on, but you can always cache more. There's plenty that you can be doing, be it on the front end. Perhaps you've got a JavaScript application on the front end, a single page application. You can cache different amounts of information on the front end. You can cache in the browser carefully. And finally, you can improve your third-party script usage. This goes along with plugins, but it also goes along with adding tracking scripts and other things. You can watch what third parties are loading scripts. Do you really need that Facebook plugin on the side of your site? That Facebook widget? Because it's loading Facebook tracking scripts as well. It's bogging down your site little by little because it's trying to load the assets that are important to its widget. There are so many facets of optimization that it's kind of tough to cover in this amount of time, but you can start thinking about them. You don't have to be a developer to start optimizing your site, to start considering the humans that are trying to access your site. So start exploring some of them. Start doing your page speed tests now. And you can see some of those results. You can see improved usage. You can see improved visitors. You can build user trust. And for that, I want to open up questions, if anyone has any.
Thank you. Give it up. Very nice.
Thank you.
So are there any questions from the audience? Yes, over there.
Yeah. Do you have to stand up?
Yes, please.
Yeah?
Yes, please.
Okay. Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
So what if I have a local customer? Well, I'm an SEO, I have a customer. He has a website, and it's for a local market. Do I still need a CDN in that case?
Maybe is the answer. I would say consider what other optimizations can you do. CDN is not the be-all, end-all, in my opinion. You can add caching plugins locally on your site that will improve it. You can optimize your assets, add minification. There are lots of things you can do, and the order I listed is not specific. So yes and no. If you've done everything else, if you've exhausted everything else, then perhaps you do want to look at a CDN because they have quick connections to the network that you're trying to access.
Okay, thanks.
I saw another question right over there.
Hi, Maura. Thanks for your talk. Yeah. Who, in your opinion, should be responsible for the performance? Like the SEO or the product owner? Or what's your experience on that?
I think the SEO has a place in making suggestions, in saying we could be improving the performance, especially if you pull some things like the speed test and say, this could be better. This would help, because as we know, we're going to have fewer pages crawled if our performance is really terrible. So that could help improve your ranking. It could. The developer is someone that could own performance, in my opinion, if they have a development agency or someone they're engaging with. If there is no development agency, then I would say it should be on the site owner. And they should consider adding a consultant for that, consider moving their hosting, consider adding the CDN service. But that requires knowledge. That requires some know-how and some trust in what you're doing. That's my answer, though. Yeah, I think the SEO definitely should be cognizant of it. It's something we're all responsible for. Thank you.
I saw another question right there at the back.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. You mentioned Nginx, Apache, or a combo. Do you prefer a certain setup?
Yeah, I prefer Nginx. I don't think Apache is even particularly needed in most cases. I think many of the challenges with Apache is that it has been used for such a long time that many of us have HTTP redirects and things like that in our htaccess files that generally need migrated to better perform on Nginx. But Nginx is faster, in my opinion.
Oh, only, not in combo with Apache. And for the caching plugins like W3 Total Cache or what is it?
WP Super Cache and W3 Total Cache have been around forever. And To me, there's not a huge difference. It depends on what server you're running. I have swapped them out one-to-one because one wasn't working on my site, frankly. So I use those with a little bit of caution. WP Rocket has had some good reviews. I've heard little things about it here and there. I haven't personally tried it out. But I also believe they have some paid services too, which could be interesting. So it's really in what works best for you on your setup.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question right here at the front.
Thank you. I have a personal website and it runs a theme I bought and it loads a lot of extra assets for WooCommerce and extra stuff. Is there an easy way to see which assets I can remove? Because I tried it before and I broke my website twice.
Ooh. That's a great question. What assets can you remove? I generally would like to have some sort of staging or development environment, or if you're comfortable trying out setting up a local development environment, that's where you can tinker with that and break your site all you want. Because that's how developers test things, try things, figure them out, is we have these safe environments that we can break things, set them back, break them again, and keep fixing and tweaking until they stop breaking.
But it's unfortunately, there's no easy way to see, well, you're not using these functions or these assets. It's just really trial and error.
With JavaScript, it's very challenging. You would have to read through the code, and at that point, if you can't unset a whole file, then yeah, you need it loaded in. And they might be looking for each file that it needs. So it's a very much a balancing act.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Yes, right over there at the back.
Oh dear.
Good luck.
Oh, good throw. So close.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'd like to ask about image optimization, because we all know that images take up a bulk load of when the website is loading up. And nowadays, Google, it generally suggests using next formats, like to use next-gen formats for the images, like WebP and JPEG 2000 and XR, if I remember correctly. But the problem is that it's not supported on every platform. So talking about web browsers, do you still use these next-gen formats, or how do you react to these suggestions by Google Insight?
I would generally find a solution that allows me to utilize both. So there are plugins that allow you to lazy load images, for example, and they use JavaScript to detect where the browser is, what browser is running, perhaps the user is running, perhaps. And in that, you could potentially swap out images and say this browser supports WebP, so let's go ahead and load that instead of forcing the user to download the JPEG.
Okay.
But honestly, it depends on the size of the site and what other optimizations I could make. I still use JPEGs on my site.
Okay, if I could just quickly have a follow-up question. So if you've used, or you talked about switching for what kind of browser, of course you can detect, but do you have any concrete example of how to make this switch when the server detects that you're using this browser?
Yeah, if you watch the process on how images are lazy loaded, essentially, JavaScript, you write JavaScript and you write tags that the JavaScript can then watch and detect, and after those detections are made, it makes updates to the DOM. So it makes updates to the actual HTML that then triggers the image to be loaded. So yeah, JavaScript would do a lot of that detection for you.
All right, great, thank you.
I saw a question behind you.
All right, thank you for your talk. I have a question about GT metrics. Do you always try to get like 100 out of 100? Or is it okay when you say like it's 90 or like 85? Do you always try to get 100?
If someone's getting 100 out of 100, I'm impressed. I don't generally aim for that. I want A grades. I want grades in the 90s if possible, or percentages in the 90s. But there are so many things you can do for optimization and so many facets of the website that getting 100 out of 100 on a site of any size, yeah. I would say I'm not frustrated by that. And then I would go to Google PageSpeed, and PageSpeed might tell me something slightly differently. and give me different ratings.
Yeah, exactly. So do you where's the balance in that? Do you
Yeah,
go for like Google PageSpeed, like, all right, I need to get an A grade on
I try
Google
to kind
PageSpeed,
of mesh the information together and make your own decisions on what matters most and what changes the experience of the website. Sometimes time to first byte and first paint, where the images and CSS style sheets are first loading, is far more important than getting the entire page to load in a certain amount of time. Because people find that users see something happening on the website and might stick around and wait for things to load, rather than saying, oh, this is a blank page for X amount of seconds and then just leaving.
All right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I don't know if it's a question anymore. Yes, it still is a question, right there.
Hi there. Thanks also for the presentation. I was wondering what's your opinion about web.dev, the beta from Google. Does it have any extra added value, or is it just rehashing and reconfiguring the same tools we had before?
I'm honestly not familiar with it, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
There was a question here at the front.
Hello. Question about priorities. If site would be like really crap, nothing done, and any work done yet on the site, where would you begin? Or what order, or what thing would you start off with that might have the biggest impact?
Okay, the site's really crappy.
Yeah, let's say nothing that you mentioned here was done before.
Nothing was on before. Ooh, that's a great question. It depends on my budget, and it depends on the size of the site. And it depends on if I'm a developer working on the site or if I'm a site manager trying to get by with the couple little things I could do, like adding plugins. So I would consider adding a caching plugin if it wasn't an e-commerce site. If it's an e-commerce site and you don't know what you're doing, maybe find someone that you can at least go to if you have questions. I would consider a caching plugin. Image optimization is always a great one because that'll greatly reduce the assets. Minification, there are WordPress plugins out there that do HTML minification. That has some caveats too. You should always test it and check it once you've enabled it because it can mess with especially some header tags. Yeah, that's kind of the direction I would start in if I were looking to not spend too much. But if I am already starting to scale up my website, then I would start looking at the code. I would start looking at the theme and what PHP calls are being made, what's getting saved to the database, that direction, yeah.
Well, it's all about input and output. You're
Yeah.
trying to get the most results from the least amount of work, I understand.
Yeah.
Second follow-up question, do you also use tools like analytics to inform you about site speed? Since they also report on this, maybe match
Yeah.
other information on
As a developer, I don't spend too much time in there, so I tend to go toward the tools that I already am aware of and that I utilize for other things. Like Pingdom also has tracking of whether your site is up or down, like if your site goes out for some reason. So since I'm already in there, I tend to watch those tools. But yeah, if it's at your disposal, use it.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
We have time for one small question. Are there any more questions? Yes.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. Say you do all the optimizations and you get the A grade, which is what we're all striving for, but the site is still slow.
Okay.
And I see this quite a bit, actually.
You shouldn't get an A grade if the site is still slow.
Right, I feel
But
like
if
we
it
changed
is,
the system.
theoretically, yeah. Theoretically, if it is, I would be starting to look at your underlying code base. That's the direction I would go because it generally is, say you're querying for a bunch of posts and post meta in WordPress, that stuff can get really time consuming. You might be using external APIs and those external APIs are slow.
Okay.
So you're making a connection to a sister site or an external API that you're pulling in related posts for, perhaps. Things like that can be cached, optimized, but it starts getting pretty complex. You you want to have a development team for that
Okay,
occasionally, you know.
I feel like
Or
frequently we're
consider one.
gaming the system to get the A, even if we're not seeing the speed. And I've seen people complain about a lower grade, even though their site is fast.
Yeah, and that's why the lower grades you have to accept. You can't have the mentality that it must just all be A's. You have to have the mentality that it needs to perform well for the humans using it. So yeah, thank you.
All right, that was the last question. So give it up for Maura.
Awesome, thank you.